Welcome everyone to today's talk by Dr. Arnab Chatterjee, who is a former fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla, and is the author of Is the Personal Beyond Private and Public? New Perspectives in Social Theory and Practice, Sage 2018, and Categorical Blue, Personality Ethic in Social Work and Other Structures of Helping, IIA's Shimla publication in 2017. Currently, he's working on a book manuscript titled The Philosophical Discourse of Alternative Modernity, a Late Response to Habermas. This session will be chaired by Professor and poet Subodh Sarkar, who's the chairperson, Paschim Bongo Kobita Academy, Ministry of Information and Cultural Affairs, Government of West Bengal. Professor Subodh Sarkar is reader in English at City College, Kolkata, and has been a Nehru Fulbright Fellow at the University of Iowa. He won the Sahitya Akademi Award and Gangadhar National Award for Poetry, preceded by Gulzar, and is an internationally traveled and published poet, having published over 42 books, translated in more than 19 languages. Professor Sarkar is also the former editor of the prestigious journal Indian Literature, published by Sahitya Akademi, and currently heading the Bengali Advisory Board of the Sahitya Akademi, India.
Dr. Rosinka Chaudhary, eminent scholar and director of the center, and today's speaker, Dr. Arnab Chatterjee, and other scholars present here in the audience. I have just a small note, a short note I have written as he was discussing the subject with me. So I think it would be better for me to read it out to you, and then he will start speaking or reading or talking, whatever it is. So just a short note on the subject. I have always been saddened by the limitation of jurisprudence as practiced in the courts of law, and intrigued by the divinity of poetic justice. God had a very high status in antiquity, but his status in modern age, after Nietzsche, is that of a temporary job. Though the Shining India team is now trying to establish God as the divine Supreme Court. But it seems to me that Dr. Chatterjee, he is going to speak about a different God and his divine justice that prioritized the ethical legitimization of the ideas of the triumvirate, Tagore, Gandhi, and Vivekananda. Because he has already mentioned in the abstract that he is going to talk about the philosophy of Tagore, Gandhi, and Vivekananda in connection with law or jurisprudence. The conflict between good and evil reigned supreme in all literatures, ancient and medieval, as it continues to remain pivotal in the masterpieces of modern times. Poet Raul Zurita, a living legend of Latin America, came all the way from Santiago to Delhi to attend the Poets' Meet, to which I was invited to read my poems. He was jailed because you know that Raul Zurita is still one of the finest poets of Latin America, and he was jailed for so many years, over a decade. And he came to Delhi with his poems, read it out to us, and what he said, I'm quoting that. He was jailed after the elected President Allende was assassinated by a CIA-aided dictatorship, and Pinochet, the tyrant, was made president. And interestingly enough, that Pablo Neruda because he was living in Santiago at that time, and he died just on 11th September that year, when Pinochet came to power as dictator. And strangely enough, that people were talking about the divine justice at that time. What was going to happen to people of Chile, of Latin America? Jurita told me that he was never told the reason what he was jailed for. He said, "Look at me. I am now free, but my whole body is diseased, and it is always shivering like a moth. Is there any God? Is there any court of law? Alas, my crime is that I wrote poetry." What was the name of the crime committed by Antigone? Because he is going to talk about Antigone in details, right? Not at least as a case study, because he has already referred to that in his paper, I think. So, what was the name of the crime committed by Antigone? She followed the divine law. She wanted to give a proper burial to the corpse of his brother. Creon, the perpetrator, who represented the state laws, denied him the burial because he was a traitor. The archetypal conflict continued even in the time of US-led Iraq war, and now seen in Ukraine, when the corpse of a soldier is denied the basic law of divinity, and the death of a human being should be honored. Gandhi, the god of human civilization, as described by Roma Rolla, never believed in the dictum that propagated eye for eye. He said, if we follow this, the world would be rendered as entirely blind. This eyelessness will neither do good to good nor to bad. Vivekananda's God was a God for Shudra Jagaran, for the rise of the mass Dalit. And Tagore thought of a real utopia where he dreamed that the best judgment is the one when both the punisher and the punished are saddened and tearful equally. With 40 years of experience as an Indian writer writing in Bengali, quintessentially, I have seen villains as gainers and heroes sufferers. The good finally triumphs over the bad, but we have to wait for the blue moon to rise in the sky. And I think that Dr. Chatterjee is going to talk about the law and literature, and in connection with the time past, the time present, and possibly this two times present in the concept of future. So in a way, I believe that this is a perennial question, a question that has never been answered properly, a question that Sophocles started asking, and still the human civilization doesn't know the answer. We all wait for poetic justice, for divine law, but finally where we arrive, we really don't know. And let's hope that Dr. Chatterjee is going to give us a glimpse of a happiness that we all wait for. Thank you.
So this is kind of trivial immortality, right? Now, firstly, the title itself, that Tagore, Vivekananda, Gandhi and their jurisprudence, our search for legal philosophical modernity. I'm going to at least expend 2 or 3 sentences on elaborating upon the title itself. Firstly, jurisprudence. Because I've taught jurisprudence and I've confronted the confusion which is peculiar to classes in jurisprudence as well as in textbooks and for instance in academic books. The distinction between legal theory, philosophy of law and jurisprudence. This distinction is not at all clear. So 2 or 3 sentences on this distinction. The moment we say legal theory, this theory has to be pitched or pitted against what you call practice, right? Legal theory is orientated towards legal practice. The philosophy of law is a cut above where you have generalizations upgraded to certain forms of universalization in terms of concepts or categories. But jurisprudence, actually, the jurists or jurisprudence, they arose with the Roman law. Jurisprudence is the most interesting stuff. And since Plato, even Aristotle, Plato has a book called Laws, jurisprudence is the most interesting stuff because as I try to argue that, whether a law is a good law or a bad law, whether a law can render justice or the distinction, the difference between the law and the justice, this space is traversed by jurisprudence. When we confront unjust law or a bad law, the problem or the lack in justification is awarded or offered by the science of jurisprudence. So jurisprudence is basically the science of justification, not application, right? So now when we say Vivekananda, Gandhi or Tagore and their jurisprudence, what I'm trying to argue is they have offered few arguments and principles in favor of justification. Justification of norms, rules, categories or whatever, right? So this is one part. Another is the question of legal philosophical modernity. Now, modernity, as we all know, and you know far better than me, modernity is fundamentally a Western inscription tied to certain parameters of, certain mechanics of science, technology, the techne, objectivity, formalization, conventionalization, universalization, and as well as what you call the lust for disenchantment. I mean, there is, in Bengali and Hindi also, there's a word called maya or illusion. To get out of the delusion, illusory matter, the destruction of illusory matter is sometimes described in Weberian words as disenchantment, right? So modernity entails disenchantment and all kinds of formalization and universalization, scientificity. But one of my contributions, as I'll try to argue further here, in terms of secularization. You know that modernity entails secularization. There's a difference between the state and the church. And this is the secular paradigm, which is very popular, and you have very many writers and theorists. There's a huge literature on the secular. Charles Taylor or Rajiv Bhargav, Professor Partha Chatterjee has written extensively on this. But my contribution, my addition here, humble addition, as I'll try to argue and sort of, I'm working on this as well, that you see, if you take Habermas once, then Habermas makes a very important point. He says that in modernity, certain disciplines become autonomous. The morality, science and art, they appear as separate spheres, separate departments of life practices or existence. You cannot judge science by the criteria of art, right? You cannot judge literature on the basis of morality. They have all their own criterial norms and they'll be validated as such. The question of art for art's sake the question of autonomy of literature actually arose in this era. Now, if this is taken for granted, I think this is true, Habermas is right here and nobody has disputed this. Then, what I see, that secularism is a discourse of separation, not limited to the differentiation or the distanciation between the church and the state. It cannot be limited to this. When you're trying to differentiate or separate literature from morality, art from scientificity, or whatever, this discourse of separation or secularism is at work. Okay. So, in terms of this discourse of separation as a secular discourse, as a wholesome, comprehensive discourse, not limited to the church and the state separation or politics and religion, right? Then you'll see, we must actually wonder, how does Tagore, Gandhi or Vivekananda actually feature? Because they were obviously working within the mechanics of this separation, right? You say, for instance, Tagore would belong to literature. He used to repent. Amar সম্পর্কে বলা আমি সব সময় কাব্যি করি. I always poeticize everything, right? Vivekananda will belong to religion or theology. And Gandhi will belong to a kind of communitarian utopic discourse, right? Say, one might say even politics. Now, this separation of discourses and separation of this kind of iconic, emblematic persons or individuals, we shall actually realize that this separation, this discourse is not working here, right? With Gandhi, with Tagore, and with Vivekananda. The challenge is to see that, in fact, this is the question that can be posed, whether the question of alternative modernity lies here, that this discourse of separation has somewhat failed here. In the West, this, I think, problem, this question has not been posed at all. It has been, in a sense, successful. Okay. So, my hunch here basically is this all three. One is, simply put, Tagore, Vivekananda and Gandhi's, legal inputs, their jurisprudence, their forms of justification, and how all these can mesh or can engender an alternative modernity. You have questions of modernity. We've been debating it for decades, right? There are books, called Alternative Modernity from Duke University. I think Patgaonkar, Partho Chatterjee has written on our modernity. But you see, these tracts or books, I think, we have had huge canonical works on Western modernity. Say, from Hegel, Kant to Habermas, the philosophical discourse of modernity. Can we say that we have a theoretical discourse, a challenge to the question of these Western canonical texts? That this is the theory of alternative modernity. When Partho Chatterjee is writing on our modernity, he is not offering a theory. He is historicizing. He is giving historical examples. He says these attempts were there. So, for instance, wearing a dhoti instead of a pant, practicing this kind of medicine rather than that, and giving queer examples. He says that we might find some laughable, but the attempt was sincere. So, he is historicizing. Partho Chatterjee is not offering a theory. I have not come across a theory of alternative modernity. We have plural modernities, indigenous modernity, post-colonial modernity. But if you ask, what is the theory of this post-colonial modernity? There is no one answer. There is no theory as such. But if you say Western modernity, is there a theory of Western modernity? Of course there is a theory. And Habermas is the last unchallenged tome. It is still there. Okay. So with this kind of maneuver and mechanics, I am trying to arrive at whether there could be a theory of alternative modernity, pace Gandhi, Tagore and Vivekananda. Now, let me start with Vivekananda a bit, okay? Vivekananda, for instance, tries to define law. What is law? Vivekananda borrows this definition from actually logic, right? And he says, what is meant by the word law? By law is meant the tendency of a series to repeat itself. Law is repetition. Without repetition, there is no law, right? Like there is an incident or an event. This event will be followed by another event. This vicious circle, this kind of production of, a series of events is, to Vivekananda, is law. And for this, Vivekananda says, actually, if this is law, then this cannot be broken. Once it can be broken, it is not law. For instance, there is a law, there is a dictum, there is a legal norm that you shouldn't steal. But there are people stealing. Once you have the norm, do not steal, broken, then to Vivekananda, and I'll say this is a pure theory of law, not Kelsey's, that this is no law at all. Then what is actually Vivekananda's theory of law, which he thinks cannot be broken? It's not natural law, I mind it. To some theorists, natural law is a law which cannot be broken. Like, for instance, today's human rights, for instance, is one example of natural law. I mean, there's an ontological argument that I'm born human, so I have human rights. This is a cut above all political, civil, and all kinds of rights. Vivekananda actually derives his theory of law from the law of karma or action. He says, we are the cause and we are the effect. Every action, we all this know, every action will produce some kind of consequence. This is a consequentialist argument. Vivekananda says that if this is a consequentialist argument, then the effect of the cause, we are the cause, we are the effects. This cannot be broken. The law of karma, for instance, is the ideal law for Vivekananda. Now, you pit this against the typical natural law theories of the West. Vivekananda is not trying to argue. Karma is not even action, right? Karma is a cut above the theory of action. They have these theories of action, right, in analytical philosophy. It's not that, right? Now, but while talking about law as the repetition, as a series, Vivekananda also tries to define nature. He says nature is the difference between resistance and non-resistance. Very modern expression. Resistance and non-resistance. Now what is that? Vivekananda argues, and Vivekananda makes a distinction between external nature and internal nature, bohi-prakriti and anta-prakriti. He says, external nature, can be resisted. And what we call, sort of our earthly habitations are a product of resisting external nature. His actual example is the ascetic or the sannyasi. Now the ascetic actually overcomes not only external nature, there are limitations, but he or she overcomes internal nature, right? He overcomes, for instance, the pull of lust and desire. Now the ascetic features in Weber, for instance, in Max Weber. And there the ascetic is one example or argument where asceticism produces, in terms of Protestantism, capitalism. Vivekananda is not actually projecting the ascetic in those terms. He is rather trying to project the ascetic in terms of overcoming, Nietzschean overcoming of external and internal nature, right? Desire, for instance. Vivekananda's example is, desire. Sannyasi is one who overcomes desire. And in his last days in Velur Math, for instance, he would not allow any sort of household domestic disciple to enter his room. He would say, I can smell incontinence in him, right? This is kind of, one might find outrageous. But Vivekananda's examples are actually this. And when it comes to, this repetition or a kind of cycle, a vicious cycle, Vivekananda settles on a kind of cosmological argument. But he denies the word creation. He says, I'll not use the word creation. Once, for instance, in the instance of a conversation, Vivekananda was asked, well, Swamiji, what do you think? How does the infinite become the finite? How does God become avatara? He says, look, this is a wrong question to ask. Why, when, how? This question can be asked of the finite. You cannot ask, these questions cannot be asked of the infinite, right? How, when, how? So this question in itself is wrong. And that is why he denies that the word creation or srishti. He says there is a particular contention that, the world was created someday. The God had created. No. And he was in fact confronted by the famous dictum we know, God is dead. Vivekananda said, the moment you say God is dead, God becomes a substance and immutable. Once you say God is dead, the famous Nietzschean dictum, God is dead. He said, the moment you say God is dead, then you have to assume that God was born someday. But if he is birthless, if he cannot be born, he cannot die either. So Vivekananda here again is actually trumping or putting aside all kinds of modern objections to a particular kind of theology. So Vivekananda replaces the word creation or srishti by the word, very contemporary word, projection. He says, I deny the word creation. The word actually will be projection. And projection, something not out of nothing, but something always comes out of something. I mean, we have those famous definitions of, truth as the longest lie, right? Vivekananda says, not at all. I mean, you cannot have truth coming out of lie, truth coming out of error. No. There could be levels, but truth could only emerge from truth itself. Not anything which is not truth. Not anything which doesn't resemble its nature. Right? So, he talks about here actually certain eternal principles founded upon the universal laws in nature. Now, the question of these universal principles, when he gets down, he talks about minor laws. General, legality or laws, the municipal laws, the governmental laws, these, for instance, for Vivekananda, are minor laws. And you have today, for instance, you have what you call minor jurisprudence, in which you are dealing with laws and betrayal in friendship and love, right? This is what is called the substance of minor jurisprudence. But Vivekananda long ago is talking about, minor laws. Okay. And when he actually talks about minor laws, he talks about, customs, for instance. We have a big discourse on customary habits, customary laws which we have sort of inherited through tradition. He talks about, these changeful customs. And in fact, he doesn't want to, give a very big name to customary laws itself. Rather, and this is what should be disturbing to you, to many of us, he talks about caste laws. When he says caste laws, there is already some monks were actually doing work, and they had to separate themselves from Ramakrishna mission. One was Swami Someshwarananda, who used to write with the pen name of Mitra Kautilya. His two canonical books still is Itihas Chintai Vivekananda, Marks of Vivekananda, Biplab Chintai, 3 books. Now, Vivekananda made a distinction between 4 historical periods. One is the Brahmanican period, ruled by knowledge. You will recall Plato, for instance. The second is the military period, as if, right? The Kshatriya, the period run by the Kshatriya. Then comes the commercial period run by commerce. It's the period ruled by the Vaishyas. And the last period that Subodha rightly invoked, is the period belongs to Shudras, and he prophetically had predicted that Shudra revolutions will happen in Russia and China. Peculiar. This is a kind of astrology at its worst, right? Russia and China. Okay. So, while he was talking about caste laws, he was in fact praising a part of it. He said, the colonial predicament, the colony remained untouched. I mean, we will never overcome by other kinds of, foreign intervention or external apparatus, English or otherwise, largely because the caste had obstructed their inroad. The caste is our territory. The caste laws are laws which are nearly unbreakable. Okay. And of course he was criticizing when it comes to caste laws, the kind of oppression, the kind of, severe exploitation. He was not quite outspoken about it. But like the way he, for instance, praised the suicides of, Rani of Chitor, those queens, some huge numbers, hundreds, who had sacrificed themselves in order to resist. He was praising them, a kind of voluntarism, which is heroic, virtue jurisprudence, heroic. But you'll see, Rup Kanwar, during the Rup Kanwar debate, if you have had a look at Ashish Nandi's arguments during the Rup Kanwar debate, Ashish Nandi in fact was arguing something similar to what Vivekananda had argued, that in terms of preserving certain kind of virtue which is given by caste laws or community laws, they should have the autonomy to decide for themselves whether they should die or not. Any other kinds of municipal law in terms of universal arguments, this cannot be, simply put, Ashish Nandi was, as you know, in some remote argument he was trying to justify the right to commit suicide, right? So, these were there. These are right kind of arguments, rightist arguments. One might find these rightist fans in Vivekananda, but I think he should be considered in terms of the whole text rather than a separate utterance, right? So, but here, now, he talks about, that what kind of laws we should have, right? He says clearly, as I mentioned it, that principles and persons are not separate. Principles are always embodied in persons. So laws cannot, they cannot be disembodied, they cannot exist in a vacuum. And this is what I say, the personalistic turn in jurisprudence. As you know, my distinction is basically that modernity is based on the distinction between the private and the public. Personal has been used as a synonym of the private. What I've tried to show in my other works is that personal has a different theory and history other than the private. Personal is rather opposed to the private. Personal is rather close to the word, public or collective or community. Okay. So, here, when Vivekananda says that persons and principles are not separate, they are one, we have this kind of post-personalist, personalistic jurisprudence. And when it comes to, formulating laws, Vivekananda says the kind of sanctions, he says the kings are gone. Now, how do we formulate laws now? Vivekananda says that we have to, formulate laws by ourselves. And the validation, the sanction should come from within. But where are the people? This self-validation of laws, as you know, validation, laws should be validated by an argument from itself. This is even the Habermasian argument, the communicative argument. But Vivekananda, this is interesting because Vivekananda was asked, what do you think about widow remarriage? Widow remarriage. As you know, Vivekananda could have had a lot of grudge against Vidyasagar because he was unemployed for long. And you know that in Vivekananda's, Vidyasagar's son-in-law's school, Vivekananda for a brief time was employed as a teacher. And then you have a deputation against Vivekananda going to the son-in-law who was the head there, that Vivekananda cannot teach. Vivekananda said, I cannot teach well. আমি তো খুব তৈরি হয়ে যেতাম, আমি পড়াতে পারি না, fine. And Shrimo, who is the Kathamritokar, the chronicler, Shrimo in a conversation says, just look at this, Mahapurush, নিজেকে কখনো নিজের সপক্ষে কিছু বললেন না, শুধু বললেন আমি তো খুব তৈরি হয়ে যেতাম। আর দেখো ইনি সারা পৃথিবীকে শিক্ষা দিচ্ছে, ইনি একটা স্কুলে পড়াতে পারলেন না, একটা চাকরি পেলেন না। তো Vivekananda says, on the basis of Vidyasagar and his whole kind of, Vivekananda says, widow remarriage, okay. So am I a widow? Why are you asking me? আমি কি বিধবা? আমাকে জিজ্ঞেস করছো। Vivekananda emphasizes the autonomy, the representative autonomy of a certain group of people who are actually in question. But he finally, of course, wraps it up by saying, so he rejects reform. Vivekananda rejects reform. Vivekananda's argument is not a reformist argument. Vivekananda is not willing to reform any social law. Rather, he says there are greater works to be done than aspiring to be lawyers and picking quarrels and such things. Gandhi would say something very similar. The lawyers, we don't want lawyers because they feed on other people, quarreling. They generate and sort of, exaggerate and, multiply quarrels rather than resolution, right? So this is Vivekananda, and of course finally says, I hate a country which is full of laws. More laws means more police, more death. More police, more death. In the 90s we have heard a song like Rashtromani Katatar. Rashtromani, Shahid Kadri, left and right, and Shubodha has written extensively on this. Vivekananda is saying more laws means, more police. Law is death. The more of the law in a country, the worse. So what we do, we sannyasis, we monks, we ascetics, what we do? We go to the mountains where there are no laws. No government, no laws. We go to the mountains. So Vivekananda in his other arguments of karma yoga, and he rather argues against monks going to the mountains. But Vivekananda's last example is, of course, those people who are completely victims of laws. They are the slaves. He says, if you ask me, one kind of definition, a terse formulation of slavery, the slavery is a product of laws. More laws, more slaves. So this is Vivekananda and his jurisprudence. Throughout nature, what happens once must have happened before and must happen in future. There is nothing in nature which is not bound by law. But this nature is different from the Western nature. He's making a distinction between external and internal nature. Right? You have inwardness in Western theories, but Vivekananda is absolutely rooted in our Shastras. Right? So, and this is a revolutionary statement. Where God is, there is no other. Where the world is, there is no God. Mark this sentence. Where God is, there is no other. And where the world is, there is no God. Because, because there's a constraint of, I might be running out of time, so I might just pronounce it here so that I won't miss it later. The distinction between Western modernity and our modernity, my thesis is, let me state it here. You've all heard of, other. self-other distinction and all kinds of stuff. And you have had the enemy as the other in Carl Schmitt, in Derrida, and friend and enemy distinction in Carl Schmitt. Then what is the core of politics? The friend-enemy distinction, right? This is Carl Schmitt, the Nazi jurist. And Derrida has, expended a lot of energy, a book on this politics of friendship. So we have distinct notion of the other as enemy in the Western discourse. My hunch here, and imbricated within the discourse of secularism as a discourse of separation of various discourses, not only politics and religion, is that our modernity, what you call indigenous, vernacular, post-colonial, whatever, is non-Western, and it includes the Islamic one, African, Islamic, and the Indianic or the Hinduanic conception. I remember having formulated a course in jurisprudence which I taught at Oro. If you look at any syllabus of jurisprudence, Oxford for instance, where jurisprudence is the most prominent, it is completely out and out Western. In India, a bit of Indian, but it misses out on the African, misses out a bit of Islamic, but the African is completely left out. So, the non-Western modernity, non-Western discourses, the African, the Islamic, the Hinduanic, the Indian, the core is we precisely lack a question of the other. We precisely lack a concept of the other. There is no other in the non-Western discourses. So our modernity is basically premised on the precondition that, on the rather axiomatic, that we lack a conception of the other. Now one might say, for instance, in the Islamic conception, one has a conception of the kafir or the foreigner. These are not political conceptions. You might have a concept of the enemy in certain tracts or the low caste, but this is not a political conception. Even in the Islamic conception, it is basically a religious conception. And because it is a religious conception, the moment you try to push the question of the enemy to grab and grasp other forms of confrontation, one will say, you are politicizing religion. This question is not asked of Western discourses. This question is never asked of Christianity. This question is always asked Islamic, even at times today I see the Hinduanic, they are also sort of confronted with this question. And this is very difficult for them because, there are already standard answers being circulated. The Hinduanic conception, they don't have one text. They don't have one God. The plurality of gods, a plurality of texts. And with this, it is impossible to project one God, impossible to project, in fact, one enemy and one other. Right? And same about the Islamic conception. It is a religious conception trying to, some people are trying to sort of extrapolate that conception to make it political. You are trying to politicize. That's true. So, the basic premise here, my premise is alternative modernity, so-called. The theory of alternative modernity is based on this, that Western modernity is premised on the question of the other as enemy. Here, we don't have the conception of the other, political conception of the other, and not at all other as enemy. In fact, if you now listen to Vivekananda, where God is, there is no other. Where the world is, there is no God. In fact, Vivekananda was asked, what do you think about, the Christian conception of love your enemy? Vivekananda said, this is peculiar. If you have the question of, once you invoke the concept of enemy, if there is love, you cannot have enemy. How can you have love and enemy at the same time? This is contradiction in terms. I don't think that this is absolutely a limitation, that you have the concept of the enemy and love. In fact, similar argument has been made by Nietzsche, and I've used elsewhere in those WhatsApp discourses because Facebook I've been absent for a while. Nietzsche makes a categorical point. And this makes sense enough. We have certain students of women's studies, they will know much more than me, that those celebrated, circulated concept metaphors like respect and consent. Nietzsche says, respect and love cannot go together. Where there is love, there is no respect. Where there is respect, there is a hierarchy, there is an order, right? One is caught up in a thrall and held in awe that one is, sort of, and this is a book, I think it is. So, in love is a condition of equality, of consonance, of synonymity. If I am one with the other, how can there be respect, which is a product of the order? So, similarly, Vivekananda is arguing that where you have love, there cannot be, enemy, the question of the enemy. And this argument could be extended to define our sort of modernity. Okay. Now, Tagore a bit. Tagore, and this is a sentence which will be loved by Subodh Sarkar and Professor Rosinka Chaudhary, who are internationally well known as literary theorists, and they not only read literature but they also practice literary theory. Tagore says, "You must forgive me, for the law laid in May is best broken in December." What poetic expression. The law laid in May is best broken in December. Now here, Tagore, for instance, we must, invoke the ancient, the Platonic, the Greek debate whether there could be unjust laws. And the unjust laws have to be obeyed. This was one of the, presumptive, Greek debate in Aristotle and Plato in invoking Socrates. Tagore was convinced that a colonial system is fundamentally unjust. In jurisprudence, for instance, they make a distinction between positive law, which is the law made by governments, municipal laws, and natural laws. Natural laws which are eternal, right? Don't kill anybody, don't steal. These are as if natural. Human rights, for instance, the natural I have already mentioned. So, the distinction between positive law and natural law, Tagore is saying actually that our colonial law is positive. But colonial settlement or the colonial argument always takes recourse to natural laws. The Lockean argument that moment you see a land which is not sort of cultivated, which is barren, arid land, I mix my labor with it, the land is mine. One of the basic premise of colonial, habitation and the predicament is again natural law itself. But Rabindranath Tagore is actually inversing this. He says the colonial law is the example of positive man-made law, unjust law in its core. You cannot have a positive colonial law which is a good law, which is a just law. You remember Ambedkar had made such an argument. You cannot have a good Brahman master. You cannot have a good caste. Good Brahmin, you cannot have my master is good. If this is the argument of the slave, this is self-defeating, right? So Vivekananda Tagore is actually saying that all colonial law is positive law, not deriving, and above positive law is the prakritik shabhavik niyam, natural laws, right? To trump colonial positive law, we have to take recourse to natural universalistic arguments. And the colonial law, as you know, Tagore's one of those best canonical paradigms. It derives from the political state system, Rashtra Babostha. and which had gone unleashed, having gone against its own publicized liberal spirit, a police security state. Tagore actually says this. It's a terror of law and order. A terror of law and order indifferent to the citizens' system of emergent needs. And Tagore argues that what I see basically in the name of law, দারোয়ান চারিদিকে দারোয়ান দাঁড়িয়ে রয়েছে আর এই দারোয়ানদের রাজত্ব চলছে. What I see are gatekeepers, and the gatekeepers and the surveillance, this is what is taking its toll. So he was asked, for instance, don't you want law and order to prevail in the country? He says, definitely yes, but not above life and mind. Now, this disjuncture between law and order and life of the mind, what I think is key to Tagore's legal theory or jurisprudence. People indulge in litigation, I've already quoted, that he says, Manush mamla kore ken? The lottery ananda. The legal indeterminacy in litigation is enjoyed by the people. So they indulge in litigation. And such, what is the result of this indeterminacy? As you know, there is a critical legal theory in jurisprudence, critical legal studies. And they emphasize on indeterminacy of laws. They try to argue in terms of political axiom that indeterminacy of laws. Tagore is arguing what is the result of this indeterminacy. The result of this indeterminacy is the innocent is convicted and the guilty is freed. But the self-defense argument of natural law, Tagore reiterates that law cannot save her who cannot save herself. And subsequent to invoking self-defense, Tagore called British justice and took recourse to natural law principles in order to trump principles of established colonial positive law. He said government does not always run by the policies it frames. There is a substance called natural law, right? Now the moment, let us try to hold on to this, that when Gandhi argues that there could be, Tagore argues unjust laws inherently because the system is unjust. Therefore, taking recourse to natural law, it could be violated. The laws could be violated. Gandhi would invoke the question of civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is a civil violation of laws, unjust laws. In fact, the argument just follows, right? Now, as you know, our legal modernity, for instance, as much has been written about it, not much, but how was it done? It was done by formalizing law codes, codification, system of legislation in the common law tradition, right? The customary law was put aside, and what was strikingly put aside, what has emerged in the recent researches, is a multiple non-state legal traditions. It's a matter of ethnography, legal ethnography. Those who are doing ethnography, they might be interested in legal ethnography in which multiple non-state legal traditions are being invoked. And Vivekananda actually, when he was talking about minor laws, he was talking about this kind of non-state, and Tagore makes much of it. Now, finally, after meditating on this kind of law and legal thinking, justice, unjust law, Tagore gives it a literary twist. Tagore was, as you know, he was himself in trouble with the Kollol people and all kinds of stuff, debate happening. Tagore is not enough modern and all kinds of stuff. But here, Tagore is absolutely, I say, modernist, because he says that in modern literature, modern poetry, what we find is disinterested. 19th century, for instance, Shaftesbury and all kinds of thinkers, as you know, disinterestedness is the key which defines modern literature. পৃথিবীকে তদ্গতভাবে দেখা, not in an engaged, interested manner, right? To watch the world as if in an ecstasy moment, in an ecstatic moment of disinterest. Modern legal fairness for Tagore is based on this kind of disinterestedness. But these people, as you know, Tagore was not enough modern. They are not convinced about disinterestedness being, actually productive of fairness or impartiality or neutrality. To look at things without the burden of a bias. And Tagore uses the word, a gaze without attachments. The moment Tagore transposes this aesthetic category to the question of legal fairness, we say that Tagore is transposing the question, the norm of aesthetic modernity to the realm of legal modernity. And again, the secular separation of legality and aesthetic is abolished by this kind of sheer gravitation. In a streak of finger, I think. So this Tagore actually then is invoking aestheticness as a failed key to legal fairness. Now, having said this, Gandhi, when we come to Gandhi, you've heard enough of Gandhi's talking about Swadeshi justice, homemade justice, Gandhi's aversion to technology, scientificity, and all kinds of stuff. You have heard of it, right? He is averse to modern governmentality, apparatus, instrument. But what I am interested, how actually Gandhi, when he says, and this is the last part of my presentation, is Gandhi says, lawyers produce and exaggerate, they sort of upgrade and generate quarrels. We don't need lawyers. It is their business and occupation. How can, if there's a dispute between two people, how can a third decide what is good and fair for them? When there is, village dispute, the parties know what is right. And they're in full knowledge of the dispute. What will the third do? But in Western jurisprudence, this third, for instance, Alexander Koyev, who was a great Hegelian theorist, who made Hegel fashionable. Koyev has a great book called The Phenomenology of Right, in which he talks about extensively on the question of the third. The third is our model of justice. The judge, the lawyer, all appearing as the third. Gandhi actually denies the third. So how is this possible? Now, this is the last point that I'll make, that in our, when there is a friend-enemy binary, we don't have the other. We don't have the other as enemy. This is the fundamental premise of our modernity. And taking cue from Gandhi, we don't have it because we have abolished, our will to abolish the third. We don't have the third here. For Gandhi, the third is not there. For the Western people, not only the friend-enemy opposition, this opposition can be resolved when a third appears. For Gandhi and our modernity, this opposition is vexed. It does not exist. There is no other. There is no other as enemy. We don't have that concept. Secondly, no third is allowed to come here. No third will resolve our problems. So, this is basically the question of these three people thinking legal thoughts, and the question of, not only jurisprudence, but the question of our legal philosophical modernity, if you can generate any vision out of these three. But the last point, I was wondering whether, who actually proposed this theory of alternative. alternative modernity, alternative whatever. When did it first become fashionable? I came across, actually Marx makes a point like this, that it was a utopian socialist, so-called utopian socialist, who first tried to project an alternative society, right? In fact, they tried to replace civilization by association. And they tried to project alternative societies where people would live together. It was the utopian socialists who projected alternative. When we try to come out of this, we are trying to come out of that project which Marx had forcibly denounced, but our utopic communitarian discourse, I think we can derive much of the energy and inspiration from Gandhi, aided by Tagore and Vivekananda. Thank you very much.
तो जो मैं आपसे सवाल पूछना चाहती हूँ कि मैं फिलॉसफी से नहीं हूँ और मैं कंटेंट कितना समझी हूँ मैं आत्मविश्वास के साथ नहीं कह सकती। मैं
हमें किसी का आत्मविश्वास यहाँ पे नहीं है, और हम फिलोसॉफी के हम बहुत कुछ के है नहीं भी है, सबको यहाँ पे फिलोसॉफी के है भी है नहीं भी है।
मैं एक समाजशास्त्रीय दृष्टिकोण से सवाल पूछ रही हूँ कि पहला सवाल ये है कि आपने 3 फिगर्स को लिया, जिसमें 2 बंगाली हैं, 1 नॉन बंगाली है, और भी नॉन बंगाली फिगर्स हैं, उनको आपने क्यों नहीं लिया? पहला सवाल ये है। दूसरा सवाल ये है कि ये जो विवेकानंद है, आपने बीच में हल्का सा मेंशन किया था कि उनको हमें समग्रता में समझने की ज़रूरत है, जिसे मैं अग्री करती हूँ, लेकिन उन्हें कुछ लोग राइटिस्ट भी समझ सकते हैं। तो उसी से जुड़ा हुआ ये सवाल है कि क्यों विवेकानंद को अप्रोप्रिएट करना दक्षिण पंथ के लिए आसान है, लेकिन कुछ फिगर्स ऐसे हैं जिनको अप्रोप्रिएट करना बिल्कुल भी आसान नहीं है, जैसे कि पेरियार ने भी तमाम मुद्दों पर, जिन मुद्दों पर विवेकानंद अपनी बात रख रहे हैं, उन मुद्दों पर पेरियार ने भी अपनी बातें रखी हैं। तो क्यों ऐसा होता है कि कुछ भारतीय फिलोसोफर्स अप्रोप्रिएट किए जा पाते हैं और कुछ नहीं किए जा पाते हैं? ये 2 सवाल मैं आपसे जानना चाहती हूँ।
थैंक यू वेरी मच। पहला सवाल वो बंगाली नॉन बंगाली वाला थोड़ा अगर अब 2 बंगाली
जैसे 2 बंगाली और 1 नॉन बंगाली को आपने लिया है, और भी नॉन बंगाली फिगर्स हैं अपार्ट फ्रॉम गांधी, उनको क्यों नहीं? जैसे अम्बेडकर को क्यों नहीं लिया? अम्बेडकर तो खैर कानून के ही व्यक्ति थे, तो उनको क्यों नहीं लिया? गांधी को आपने क्यों लिया है? उसके पीछे आपका राष्ट्रीय है।
अच्छा, पहला एक है गांधी तो गुजराती थे, पर आप जानते हैं जो हर सुबह वो बंगाली सीखते थे। हाँ, वो एकदम शौकीन थे, और आई थिंक I don't know whether he had a teacher or not, but every day he used to write a paragraph. Even during जो प्यारेलाल के last days of Gandhi है, उसमें even last day तो he practiced his Bengali and kind of stuff. तो ये distinction इस तरह से मत मानिए कि बंगाली नॉन बंगाली। आई एम टॉकिंग अबाउट नॉन वेस्टर्न मॉडर्निटी। तो आई वुड बी ग्लैड, इनफैक्ट अम्बेडकर पेरियर आई हैवंट डन मच ऑन पेरियर, बट अम्बेडकर आई वॉक्ड, मेरे किताबों में अम्बेडकर की ये है। बट अम्बेडकर इनफैक्ट इन EPW आई हैड रिटन रिस्पॉन्स टू श्रीवात्सन's आर्टिकल ऑन अम्बेडकर। उसमें आई हैड मेड दैट पॉइंट एक्चुअली दैट अम्बेडकर की जो डिस्कोर्स है पूरे ना, वो जो सिविक रिपब्लिकन डिस्कोर्स जिसको कहे जाते हैं, पूरी के पूरी वही है। बट नॉट दैट इट डजेंट हैव दैट इमांसिपेटरी फोर्स, इट हैव दैट। बट नॉन वेस्टर्न जो डिस्कोर्स, वो तो जानते हैं अब, वो तो उसका PhD कोलंबिया से थी शायद, और वो रेवेन्यू के ऊपर वो स्पेशलिस्ट थे। तो उनके जो डिस्कोर्स है वो पूरी तरह से जो वेस्टर्न, जो एक तरह से नॉन वेस्टर्न जो डिस्कोर्स जिस तरह से हम ग्राउंड कर सकते हैं, आई वुड लाइक टू बी सॉर्ट ऑफ, अगर हो सकता नो प्रॉब्लम, बट आई डिडंट फाइंड इन हिम, मैं उस आर्टिकल आई कैन नॉट इन्वोक द होल। फॉर इंस्टेंस वो जो सिविल स्ट्राइफ की बात करते, सिविल स्ट्राइफ, दिस वर्ड एक्चुअली इज यूज्ड बाय श्रीवात्सन, जो लो कास्ट ये हर स्कूल में जाए, हर नौकरी मिले उसे, वो तो आर्म्ड रेवोल्यूशन की बात नहीं कर रहे, वो यही। तो दिस रिफॉर्मिस्ट ज़ील सिविक रिपब्लिकन ट्रेडिशन में वो पूरी तरह से अच्छी तरह से है। or I actually showed this, So Srivastava in his book actually tried to say that this argument was forwarded by Chatterjee that Ambedkar doesn't have any originality. He could be seen as this and that. ऐसा नहीं, तो he is useful. I acknowledge that he is useful in किसके साथ? हाँ.
क्योंकि भले ही उनके PhD रेवेन्यू पे नहीं हो, लेकिन उन्होंने जिस प्रकार से हिंदुइज्म और बुद्धिज्म की पढ़ाई करके और एक प्रकार से भारतीय सोर्सेस से भी उन्होंने अपनाया है. इनफैक्ट उन्होंने इसीलिए क्रिश्चियनिटी को ठुकराया कि वो पूरी तरह से विदेशी माना जाएगा, तो मैं भारतीय ज़मीन से उपजा हुआ कोई धर्म अपनाऊं और उसके हिसाब से एक नया फलसफा तैयार करूं ताकि हमारे लोगों को इस ज़मीन में ज़्यादा क्या बोले मतलब एक तरीके से उनको डीनेशनलाइज ना किया जाए, क्योंकि भारतीय ज़मीन से जो उगा है उसको डीनेशनलाइज करना बहुत मुश्किल है. तो पूरी तरह से उनको वेस्टर्न कैटेगरी में भी नहीं डाला जा सकता है as far as his spiritual and public life is concerned.
I mean, I'm not emphasizing on Indian sources. For instance, caste. The way Vivekananda is arguing, not in favor of caste, because in Belur Math, for instance, he distributed sacred threads, trying to convert that all are Brahmins. All are Brahmins. I mean, there cannot be anyone. He was trying to generate that was not accepted. But the force of caste, for instance, caste लेकर नीचे में भी caste की arguments है, जो यहाँ से to abandon a particular religion, go to another religion. यहाँ से non-Western modernity किस तरह से आएगा, I'm not sure, but I'm open to it. But I didn't find in, Buddhism, for instance. Vivekananda, for instance, had great veneration for Buddha. But the argument that he makes is absolutely, in a sense, it was genealogically true, it was proved true. That what happened to, after, hundreds of years of Buddhism, that this militancy in us was nearly finished. If there is a state governmental emphasis on non-violence and non-meat eating, though Buddha was quite ambiguous about meat eating. Meat as gift was accepted. Rajogun, he would emphasize militancy. And often talking about laws, Vivekananda was talking about being, I love outlaws. So this militancy was, nearly finished. And for this reason, in the extremist clubs, Yugantar and all kinds of, in Bengal, Punjab, the extremists had Vivekananda as their guru.
I'd like to make a point. May I speak? That Arnab, the way you have spoken about this triangulation, Gandhi, Vivekananda, Tagore, it's okay, fine, absolutely. But Ambedkar, I feel personally and also academically, I have a response to Ambedkar because he is the man who worked as a force behind the rising body. So when we talk about the plurality of ideas, for example, the plurality of ideas that he has spoken about in his paper, excellent, brilliantly done by him. Now the question comes that Ambedkar, being an expert in law, right, and way back in as early as 1923, so when he was taking the water from the pond, or which was the mark of revolution, I take it as an archetypal image. That somebody who was not allowed to take water from the pond, which was demarcated, yes, exactly, demarcated for the Hindus and upper caste. And so they were not allowed. And at that time, you find, if you read Dalit literature, we are now reading Dalit literature all over the country. So you find that at that time, the people in Bombay, Bombay in Maharashtra, and also in other places, they a man walking down the streets of the blocks reserved for the Brahmins. So they have to walk, the low caste, they have to walk with a bird, with a pot hanging from his neck to speak into it. He cannot speak outside the pot. So it was a terribly major symbol. So the modern India was born out of the debris of the casteism, which involves law. And so in a way, Ambedkar is very, very important, but at the same time, the point that I wanted to make, as it has connection with what he has said in his paper, written in his paper. So that is, now, Vivekananda, as he said, Vivekananda was also responsible, instrumental, at least to inspire the downtrodden, Nietzsche, Mato, and Mato is my heart. So this inspiration for the rise of the elite, for the rise of the downtrodden, has a link with Ambedkar. And that is why possibly he has taken Vivekananda. Is not just a Shunashi, but a great propagator of the ideas which would influence Ambedkar. So in a way, I find that one of the two is around.
No, so far as the rightist, I'll link this to the rightist argument,
Yeah, right.
Vivekananda himself declared himself a socialist. He was the first one to declare himself a socialist. And there are a lot of arguments. In fact, Mitra Kautila's work, Vivekananda's Biplab Chinta, actually tries to give a communitarian picture of the socialist Vivekananda. And it was found on Nivedita, for instance. You can see Nivedita's career is a good example of what energy, what force Vivekananda could generate. So, he was a leftist, right? But so far as, this is my question also. So, in terms of political economy, I am myself a leftist, a Marxist. But you'll agree with me, all questions of identity, the questions of caste or religion, they have been not treated or addressed by leftists. They are most interestingly posed and poised by the rightists. So, in terms of political, I'm a leftist Marxist. In terms of cultural and identity questions, sometimes I find the right arguments most interesting. In that sense, to do away with the caste, Vivekananda is never doing away with not Tagore, not Gandhi, none of these three. To do away with with caste is not the Indianic modernity if Ambedkar's contention was that, to do away with caste itself, right? That kind of egalitarianism is Western. Here there are experiments with, I may say, inequality rather than equality. They are all, denouncing oppression in terms of caste oppression. Vivekananda is making experiments, giving sacred threads and all kinds of stuff. But he is also saying that caste was a block that could, resist foreign invaders. Now, if caste is done away with, then where do you stand? Vivekananda will ask that if caste is done away with, then how would we have stopped, foreign invaders? We would have been converted. And the question of modernity, Habermas, for instance, makes the question of alternative modernity. Habermas picks up this sentence. He says, then the choice is between socio-economic questions or cultural, aesthetic questions. Are we culturally modern or economically modern? Where do we find the options? In terms of economic imperatives, there is no option now in globalization. But only in terms of culture that we can be modern. And Vivekananda, time and again, he says this, that the West is this, the East is this. There could be exchange, but our forte is dharma or religion. And that is why he never made a distinction between the neutrality of state and religion, the separation, because the fundamental core is religion. If the state is there, it should be from within the realm of religion. Even the point is rather to extrapolate caste and discover the egalitarian and the more tolerable, more modern and acceptable greeds of caste. Do you get me? Caste की जो अच्छे दिख है, जो egalitarian दिख है, that is the challenge to explore and establish. I think
there are certain philosophies which are जैसे ब्रह्म समाज, उन्होंने तो एक casteless भारतीय framework की कल्पना की थी.
और ये जानते हैं आप जो ब्राह्मण समाज and all समाजेस in those days, Keshav Sen, absolutely modeled on Western. Absolutely modern. Even there, Keshav Sen used to have books on Christ, and even their association, the bylaws. They would even import the bylaws of those organizations. Why did Brahma Samaj, for instance, die? It's a bad death because Brahma Samaj in those days was progressive, right? Religiously positive, acceptable, egalitarian, absolutely. But why? Keshav Sen, his own daughter had to be married to, yeah. So that is that. Okay. So the challenge is rather to to have experiments with inequality, because this is not to be done away with. We cannot. I mean, even Ambedkar in his last days. Do you remember? He was asked about this constitution. What he said in different languages, मुझे तो वो सुपारी मिला था मैं कर दिया. I don't know anything about that.
That's why he converted to Buddhism, because he knew that constitution will not take away his people a long way. So give them a separate framework which will perhaps free them from the slavery of caste, because his people, unless and
He did that. He did that. But what afterwards? What happened afterwards?
Yeah, that is true, but it's still a new experiment.
Yeah, but
Not even
And it was also
But-
towards the end of Islam.
the end of his life.
but that could not.
Experimenting with everything.
Yeah, and there was a political background.
But that could not find a non-Western modernity which would thrive. All these Vivekananda, Tagore and Gandhi, they're the most thriving people. We have to inquire actually why. Because they're trying to stick to certain core principles which are here. But of course, trying to sanitize them. Don't think that Tagore or Vivekananda or Gandhi, they were agreeing with all kinds of oppression. No, not at all. So, but Ambedkar, of course, is a very important experiment in Indian history. But his sincerity has not been respected and has not been taken through. Yeah. Thank you.
Just a curiosity, because again I'm outside the field of legal philosophy, but as someone
No, you've done work on legal ethnography. I know.
So, no, but,
Migrants and borders, very
but
important.
Now, right now, as someone working at the cusp of gender and jurisprudence, I was just wondering, just curious, what do you think would be, because you talk about the personal, political, private, public, etc., and that has been the sort of the crux around which feminist jurisprudence, feminist law have sort of evolved. And the way some of the personalities that you've been talking about and some others have articulated the private, public, religion, etc., including some of their discourses to do with women's reforms, have in fact done a, should I call, disservice to many of the women's questions. The whole going back to harping on Shastra and bringing Shastra to the forefront to speak in favor of Shoti, widow remarriage, all of that, which has made the journey of women's movement and laws to do with women and gender very difficult at times, and that is something that women's movements have been struggling with, just to be able to bring women's questions or gender questions out of the gamut of community, religion, etc. That is exactly where women's rights are stuck. somewhere between individual rights and community rights. And we still have courtroom discourses which refer to Shastras when talking about women's protection, laws to do with women's protection, etc., etc. So I was just curious, what, if any, would be the takeaway from the discourses that you've talked about today for feminist jurisprudence, let's say?
Right. Thank you. That's an enlightening question. Yeah, but first, before I answer this, let me tell you, I wish you would be there. On 31st of March at Presidency University and the Philosophy Club of Calcutta, I'm speaking there on introducing gender neutral studies. The title is From Pariniti Chopra to Sania Mirza, introducing gender neutral studies. So I take these questions up there. I'm working on this for long. But first let me give you an instance from the Tracts and Annals of Culture Studies workshop. There was a culture studies workshop in the 90s, late 90s. In the morning there was a conglomeration, right? All had come together. Now a guy rose up and said, you have put me in a man's room. Then the professors and the people in charge, they said, what do you mean by we have put you in a man's room? Would you like to be in a woman's room? No, I'm a gay. I'm a gay. How could you put me in a man's room? Always stumped. Now the question is, we generally, we have had a lot of discourse of aggregation, unity. Sometimes the question of segregation and separation is the structural motor of identification. Either you have to know everybody's sexual orientation, he has to be put in where the other one is gay, or he has to be given a single room. It's as simple as this. This is not by bringing together, unifying, but rather segregating. Sometimes separation is the structural recognition, the motor of structural recognition. And the point of, the feminist jurisprudence is, I've mentioned it elsewhere. I think one is somewhat stumped by this assertion that it is very outrageous to say. But I want to ask you for a bit of soul searching. Do we have a feminist theory of state with Catherine MacKinnon and all others who have done a lot on pornography? We don't really have, till now, have we had a feminist state? We have had Marxist states, we have all kinds of states, Islamists. Why didn't we have a feminist state? In order to have a feminist state, we have to have a political program and we have to have a political theory of, this cannot be done by bits and pieces. This cannot be done by bits and pieces. But if you, for instance, and Vivekananda was confronted by this question. In those days, the woman's question was absolutely, painful and terrible. His own sister had committed suicide, Vivekananda's own sister. And he was asked about widow remarriage, for instance. He said, why are you asking me? But then, what is the question? His hunch was that then widows have to be remarried, educated so that they can assert their autonomy and ask for reforms. Who are the people who will ask for reform? That was his question. But now today, for instance, all those disciplinary technologies of self emerging from Foucault and all others, this education in itself is in suspicion. What kind of education? For instance, I remember a critique posed by Nityapriya Ghosh. Rabindranath was asked, what is the solution of communal conflicts? And রবীন্দ্রনাথ একটা মতামত দেবেন যে এই শিক্ষা দিতে হবে, ওদের মধ্যে যোগাযোগ বাড়াতে হবে, তো নিত্যপ্রিয় সেইং আউটরেজিয়াস ম্যান। রবীন্দ্রনাথ বুঝতেন না ওনার মতামতটা কোনো মতামতই নয়। আরে হিন্দু মুসলমানের সংঘাত হচ্ছে, ওদের শিক্ষা দিতে হবে। সেটা কোন শিক্ষা? এটা কী শিক্ষা? সেই শিক্ষা দেওয়া হচ্ছে না কেন? আর সেই শিক্ষা লোকে শিখছে না কেন? কেন এগুলো হয়ে যাচ্ছে? So, I don't think that this can be, this is the question of the woman's question and the question of feminist jurisprudence. I think they have taken the empirical questions to an extreme level. it is not purely theoretical level at which they are sort of revolving. Empiricism, a radical empiricism at its very, and radical.
The question is not about feminist jurisprudence. The question is what would be the takeaway, if any, from the three personalities?
What do you want to take?
Because you're talking about private, public, and jurisprudence, which are very, very important when we come to thinking about gender law, etc.
No. In terms of, I'm trying to argue how these three people, their legal thinking, contribute to the alternative legal philosophical modernity. Now here, woman's question should not, the way I chart them, should not feature as a separate or unique question. I don't actually...
Not should not. You don't feature it as a choice. That's not should or shouldn't.
No, in the sense, see, if you talk about, I see feminism, I see women's question, for instance, as a discourse of, universalization, justification and application of a certain egalitarian thinking. Absolutely. Egalitarianism, that's a core. If that is so, then if we have had a discourse on certain forms of equal principles, equal rights, you can customize it according to a particular population. But taking it to an extreme and exclusivity, I don't think it serves that cause. Because it does not serve that cause is an instance where we don't have a feminist state. And I've mentioned that in my categorical blue book. Yeah, yes.
Just one anecdote I would like to tell you. It happened at the International Book Fair this year. So everybody, there was a session, and the panel discussion was going on, and everybody was talking about empowerment. So the feminist takeaway that I think that there was one lady, I'm not taking her name, she was fighting for the cause of men in distress, especially by torture by women. And that lady is all in men, and she was fighting. She said that, look at the law. There are more than 100 laws and implements of these and all in favor of women. You'll be happy to know it. And only 5 or 6 laws are in favor of men. And she was protecting the men's right. So she was, very aggressively describing the whole thing. I'm not getting it. So what happened, that everybody started laughing. I say that this is a very serious thing. It's not feminist or feminist kind of thing. Feminist, quote unquote, kind of thing. It's law. Some laws are in favor of men, some laws are in favor of women, and some laws are in favor of gays. So there are laws. When we talk about, when we mix, no, this is private, this is public, and the public space and the private space, when they merge into one united whole, that's a society beautiful. I'm not talking about that. What is most important today, to look at the law as an instrument doing good to both man and woman.
No, there are many genders beyond men and women.
Beyond gender. Even that he has talked about unjust laws in connection with Tagore. So the question is, this is unjust to you. It is just to you. He has referred to the laws made by the colonizers. And we have been decolonizing our mind, not going into those laws, the colonial laws. But could we live without colonial laws for 200 years? And still they are in existence. We cannot avoid them. Most of the laws are made by the colonizers. We have made only amendments. That's a big question.
Yes, so far as just one sentence, the personal private distinction that I've made, and that is a core to my worldview. my ideal example of applying or occupying the space of the personal, where she trumps and distorts the boundaries of the public and private by a kind of self-disclosure which embarrasses everybody. Right. So, for instance, the space of which I shall sort of affirm and affirmatively sort of endorse. Right. The space of the personal should actually, the person manipulates person, private and the public, and a kind of self-disclosure which is affirmatively victorious and also embarrassing to many people. But generally we are moving around in the realm of the tolerable, the politically correct, and all kinds of stuff. Right. Yes, Rosinka, please.
You went to and perhaps deliberately so, you went to the Western theorists. You went to Weber and disenchantment, you went to the separation of church and state, you went to all of the classic Western theories of modernity. I'm not making a distinction here, this is important, between Western theories, our theories. In fact, my second question will be about that. Since you are not making the distinction so much between the poetical and the political, the religious and the political, right? Because that is the idea of choosing these three. One is in the domain of religion, one is the domain of politics, one is the domain of poetry. So you are attempting to address your question through these three prisms. So you are not making that distinction. If you are not, then when you speak of modernity, it may be useful also to then reference the notion of what modernity meant to the poets. Following the French Revolution, Robert Southey said that nothing was spoken of but the regeneration of the human race. All old things seem to be passing away. This notion, all old things seem to be passing away, in fact, is almost verbatim repeated, although he doesn't quote Southey, by Karl Marx in his early essay on the Jewish question, where he speaks about a change in the human nature itself. Modernity basically...
All that is solid melts into the air.
All that is solid melts into air is also Marshall Berman's book on, again, modernity, exactly. So, my first point was...
But it was Marx's statement, I think, all that is solid.
Marx's statement and becomes the title of Berman's book. That doesn't need repetition. I'm just pointing to a slightly different trajectory. So, point one, that your construction at the start of what the term modernity itself may encompass could take different parts, apart from the standard Habermas, Weber, church, state, all of that, which, as you yourself said at the start, so we know already. Ad nauseam, right? So this may be one way of bringing experience into a definition of modernity. Because I think experience plays some role in your formulations, as you put it at least today. So that is one. The other is to do with this search for an alternative modernity itself. Whenever we try to make this distinction of our modernity and their modernity, you yourself are quoting on the other hand, this self and other is not there in our thinking. But when you're making a fundamental theoretical argument, in fact the basic premise of your talk today, you are going exactly along that line of focusing on our modernity rather than theirs, because we somehow have something different to offer. I would say that formulation itself, which is there in poetic criticism, অক্ষয়চন্দ্র সরকার বলেছিলেন নিজস্ব পরশ ইন্দ্রচন্দ্রের কবিতা সম্বন্ধে যে ওই ইংরেজি বোনা, ইংরেজি বলে, ইংরেজি ডিজাইন, ও কি ভালো লাগে? Saying that Madhusudan and Himchandra, they're too anglicized in their poetic convention, correct? So this construction is a very, very nationalist, often very rightist construction. It leads to the danger of organicism.
it leads to the sort of criticism that Dinesh Chandra Sen advocated fiercely. It comes also from Herder and the emphasis on one language, one nation, which is what animates our politics to this day, when we hear again and again that the nation should have just one language.
You brought in Hemchandra, you have left out Navin Sen out of that essay,
Yes.
which was published in the Economic and Social History Review.
Yes, I don't want to mention sort of everything that I've written. I just want to make the point that the very search for this is a basic point I'm making, that the very search for an alternative modernity leads to an organicist search for authenticity, which leads down a precipice of rightism and nativism that you would, at least I have always argued against, and that I think if you describe yourself as a Marxist thinker, then I would think that you would want to avoid that particular trap of searching for some alternative that is specifically ours. The poets never thought in that way. Madhusudhan took from Kalidas, he took from Virgil, he took from Tasso, and he took from the Ramayana. There is no way in which a writer or a poet is not taking from world writing. There is no ours and theirs in any poetic output of significance. So I would put this basic point to do with the construction of your argument itself. Why do we need an alternative?
Yes, so thank you, Rasinkadi. I mean, it's a substantive question. When you say all old things seem to... Yeah. All old things seem to be passing away. I think this is one of the fundamental modernist premises. Baudelaire, for instance, fleeting, Benjamin made much of that kind of stuff. Okay, and experience, but experience in the sense, real life world experience of living individuals or dead individuals. Or do you want to invoke experience as, the dialectical lyric, experience as a dialectical lyric? Would you try to, bring it out of the empirical realm, or experience as narrativized or, thematized, that kind of stuff? That is my question. Experience in terms of the narrative of autobiography, or in what form? Because much has been made of, even in romantic tradition, experience, everyday life, that becomes a very problematic category. Now, more serious question is whether I'm saying that we don't have the concept of the other as enemy, but still I am proposing the non-Western modernity as unconsciously as pitting it against the Western modernity, whether it sort of repeats that what I want to avoid. Now, there's a great question when it was asked, for instance, if desiring God is within the axis of desire or not. Desiring God, you want to place yourself outside of the discourse and the realm of desire. But desiring God, won't it be desire too? Now the answer was, this desire cannot fall within the realm of ordinary desire. Right? So, my pitting up of the non-Western discourse should be taken up as a response to the universal kind of desire, universal global sort of mechanics of a particular world system, where it tries to exclude most of the people. So in that sense, that's a reality that we have to project, right? But of course, in the Western, there is the existence of other narratives, other discourse, right? As you say, in poetry, for instance, the kind of archival sources and the borrowing abolishes this distinction between ours and theirs, right? In fact, this distinction is, I'm not taking it. Precisely, I'm denying that distinction, which Carl Schmitt thinks is the core of politics, the friend-enemy distinction. And in Tagore, in Vivekananda, this distinction is denied again and again. In that sense, the poetic realm is a realm where this syncretism actually arrives. Okay. Now, the third question is more serious. Is that kind of whether this leads to a kind of organicist search of authenticity, whether nativism or kind of tribalism. Now this actually relates to Asha Singh's question whether somebody could be appropriated by the rightists or the nativist or the tribalist or not. Now it is not in their hands actually. Nietzsche, for instance, would be invoked by the Nazis. Is it in the hands of Nietzsche? I mean, Vivekananda, Tagore, Gandhi, there is immense material in all of them to be appropriated by the leftists, the rightists, and even those who occupy the space of the middle. Absolutely. All sources are there. Right. So, I mean, whether this search will actually lead to a kind of nativism or tribalism, I don't think that this is the responsibility of that particular kind of discourse. Because I cannot control or normalize the interpretations that I shall elicit. It is on the responsibility of the audience and the audiencing the discourse. It is on the kind of, education of normalcy, education of normal interpretations, education of stable interpretations. That is the role where tribalism, blind tribalism, blind nativism could be confronted, and we could bring out a rather gender-friendly as well as some gender-neutral, class-neutral, right, experience. Right. So that's it. Thank you very much.